Jeff, let's move on to another controversial subject, the US dollar. And not just the US dollar, but let's bring geopolitics into it. Let's talk about de-dollarizing. Let's talk about political intrigue as foreign capitals are setting up the United States for a fall, and some sort of spy novel thriller de-dollarization that'll send the United States, stumbling forward. It'll be a monetary Pearl Harbor. It's the story, the article, it's called Huge Massive Difference, De-dollarizing versus being de-dollared. You wrote it on July 20th. It's posted at Alhambra Investments. What inspired you to write this article?
Well, again, we're encountering these mainstream myths about what's going on in the world. And one of the mainstream myths is that central banks and really governments in general are these all-powerful financial forces that you should never, that they're behind everything. So something happens, it must be because some politician, some powerful politician or political institution somewhere wanted it that way. And we've been hearing for more than a decade how, in particular, the Chinese hate the US dollar, and therefore they are working furiously day and night to undermine the US dollar to establish some form of Chinese yuan as an alternative, hopefully to succeed the US dollar, because they're trying to strip the United States of its political might in terms of the global economy. And it's just, it's simply not true. But every time something happens, it's always attributed to this idea that the Chinese are able to, first of all, and willingly want to get this thing done, where they want to de-dollarize the entire world, not just China.
We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about central banks being central to reserve currency. We're going to talk about the Chinese political intrigue that they're working on this. But first, let's define some terms. What is de-dollarizing versus being de-dollared, and also something called special drawing rights. That's going to come up during our conversation.
Yeah, de-dollarizing is exactly what we just said, which was we're intentionally ditching the dollar intending to replace it with something else, whatever that something else is. So de-dollarizing is we don't want to use the US dollar as a reserve currency anymore. We're going to move on to something else. Now, being de-dollared is what has actually happened since August of 2007. Not all at once, but is essentially this global dollar shortage that shows up intermittently. And what that does is it's not that China is essentially ditching the dollar. It's that the dollar is leaving China behind without any kind of alternative to make up that difference. And that's what we're going to talk. Monetary tightness is the dollars leave the system and leave nothing to replace them. And we're living with the consequences of a world being de-dollared by default because nobody can intentionally, voluntarily de-dollarize. There's a big difference between those two concepts. And special drawing rights are essentially, what the IMF came up with in the 60s and early 70s. I think they became official in 72, somewhere around there, as a way of creating a global currency detached from national economies and national systems that could fill the role that John Maynard Keynes had dreamed up in the 1940s for what he thought Bretton Woods should be, his Bancor idea. So it's essentially an international currency that could theoretically could replace the dollar as performing these functions of a global reserve currency.
So if you pick up your handy geopolitical thriller, usually it involves the Chinese, the Russians, maybe the Saudis, the Iranians are involved, and there's going to be some sort of scheme, some sort of plan. A moment will occur when the world will then abandon the US dollar, and there will be terrible consequences. Now, this isn't the first rodeo, because the great power game has been going on, the European great power game has been going on for, let's say, at least 500 years, right? And there have been plenty of other reserve currencies. Jeff, I know you love reading history. Looking back through time, are you familiar with any previous de-reserve currencyization? Like, for example, why didn't the Soviet Union, which was infinitely more powerful, infinitely more motivated than the Chinese, why didn't they de-dollarize?
Well, historically, there's rarely times where there's a single reserve currency. There's usually more than one. And because of the way that the global economy developed in regional pockets, a lot of times there were mostly currency blocks rather than a global reserve currency. So, I mean, the U.S. dollar being supreme across the entire world is somewhat of a historical irregularity. However, you look at the other part of it was, what do we need to do in terms of how do we address the fact that we have a U.S. dollar system that's failing? And yeah, I think the Soviet Union, as you pointed out, Emil, probably wanted to de-dollarize, but it's it's really about what is a global reserve currency. What does it actually do, and where does it actually come from? It's not simply a bunch of politicians getting in a room and passing laws saying that we're going to start denominating all our trade in this specific currency. That's not enough. Currency is a tool that facilitates trade, not just merchandise trade strictly, but also financial flows. So you have to have, first of all, infrastructure, depth. You have to have liquidity. You have to have sophistication. You have to have the real financial power behind these, what are really markets for currency, in order to facilitate performing the role of global reserve currency. And so, yeah, the Soviet Union, like the Chinese, may have wanted to replace the dollar at certain times, but it's not that easy. You have to develop these really massive, complex marketplaces that the dollar has been able to do since the Eurodollar system first showed up in the 50s in an unchallenged way that you can't just replicate and substitute those processes overnight. And as we've seen with the Chinese, it's been 11 years now since the Joao from the PBOC first made his noise about we need to do something about the dollar in March of 2009. So 11 years later, we've been hearing about how the dollar is going to be replaced, and they're no closer to it today than they were back then. And the reason is, again, because it's not that easy. A global reserve currency requires an enormous amount of effort and an enormous amount of resources to make it happen.
That point is a really important one, and it's a thread that goes through many of your articles, and for many of the questions that I answer in the comments section on YouTube, is it's always focused on, well, the central authority decided to do X, and therefore it will happen. But as you just said, this is a key, and why isn't there inflation? It answers so many questions. There's this whole private enterprise system that is bigger, more important, and that needs to be convinced to come along. Private banks need to extend credit. Private businesses need to be profitable so as to create high quality collateral. And without that, as you say, you can't just say this is the reserve currency if you don't have the private system on your side.
Yeah, the interesting thing about especially the Eurodollar system is that it had developed outside of the official purview on purpose. I mean, they called it benign neglect, which was, we have this problem of global reserve currency, a globalizing economy, and the way we're going to solve it is to let the private system solve it for us, which it did. It solved it in a very elegant, in some ways beautiful way. It just, it overdid it. Went way overdid it in the 90s and middle of 2000s. But, the point, we had this system that developed that solved all of these problems that was an unofficial system. It was a bank-centered system. So it was outside the statutory authority of the Federal Reserve or any central bank, as well as outside the operational reach of all of the same officials. So it's not like they can just say, having allowed 50 years of this thing to go on by itself and to create all that depth and infrastructure and logistics and complications, all this kind of other thing, they can't just say, we're going to turn it off tomorrow and we're going to start doing something else. There's a very lengthy process that you would have to go through to prepare for that day when you could even theoretically do it.
There are good people, accomplished people, people that we're friends with, who say that no, because look, the foreign governments, let's say Beijing is the best example, they are selling. Jeff, you talk about this in your article. Why are they selling? Because that's an undisputable fact. There is a greater majority of treasury debt being sold. And then, very important also, Jeff, you put selling in quotes, in scare quotes. Why are they selling, and why are you putting scare quotes around it?
Yeah, people they attribute the idea of foreign central banks and governments selling to purposeful intent. They're de-dollarizing. They don't want the dollar anymore, so they're ditching US dollar assets, especially official assets, launching some kind of geopolitical tirade or something like that. When in fact, the when and where they sell corresponds to these periods that we see that are, global dollar shortages. So the reason they're selling, it's not because they're ditching the dollars, because the dollar is being de-dollared from them. They're involuntarily being de-dollared, and therefore they're trying to manage this dollar shortage as best they can by selling these US Treasuries to liquidate them, to try to supply and offset the dollar hole they're being forced into. So they're not intentionally ditching the dollar, they're being de-dollared by default, and so they're trying to sell their reserves, essentially mobilize their reserves in order to offset this dollar deficit that shows up intermittently.
So to have it right, so there's the global money centers are extending credit. They don't like the way things look. They start withholding credit, and that's the de-dollared part you're talking about. And as a result, foreign central banks have a kitty of US Treasuries, and they're selling those so as to supply their internal private networks, which still owe dollars. Is that correct? And if so, this is a common question that comes up. How come you say having a lot of reserves is actually a sign of vulnerability? The Chinese have 3 trillion worth of US Treasury, or not just US Treasury, but in reserves. You call that a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, well, there's a couple questions there. Let's take the first one first, which is, again, their selling corresponds with these dollar shortages. And so I think the way you described it exactly right. The banking system, for whatever reasons, gets skittish, like it has ever since August of 2007. Something, raises the ire of the banking system. They pull back in the amount of dollars they're offering. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be removing dollars. It can just be not growing at the sufficient rate, making dollars too expensive and too inflexible to conduct a regular business. That's monetary tightness too. So it doesn't have to be a contraction in the dollar system. It could just be not enough growth in dollars, or not enough cheap dollars, not enough fluid dollars, those kinds of things. But for whatever reasons, the banking system changes its behavior. That causes problems in the local economy, which then the central banks usually, or treasury departments, finance ministries, have to deal with. And that's when we see this selling. And interesting, if they were purposefully de-dollarizing, then why do they buy the treasuries back during what we call reflationary periods? And that's exactly what the Chinese have done and everybody else around the world. When the US dollar, when the global banking system gets back to somewhat normal reflationary condition, which means extending dollar credit, again, dollar monetary resources at more reasonable terms and more fluid situations, you see the level of treasuries rise around the world, which is, again, if they're intentionally de-dollarizing, they wouldn't do. They just ditch the treasuries and never buy them back. So it's a very good, strong correlation between dollar shortage, not dollar shortage, selling treasuries, buying treasuries. And that's basically the entire history of the last 50 years has been exactly that. When the Eurodollar system is expanding, the level of treasuries in foreign hands also expands as an indirect consequence of the dollar doing its global reserve currency. And that gets us into the other part of your question, which is, why is China's position as holding the largest stockpile of reserves on the planet, why does that mean the biggest nightmare? And the reason is because what that says is China has the greatest dollar need, because by accident, by purpose, unintentional policies, starting with the peg of yuan to the dollar, because so many dollars had flowed into China, or China needed so many dollars to trade on global markets, they were able to increase their stockpile to this immense proportion. And what that means is the larger they have as a stockpile, that must also mean the bigger the dollar problem they have that created the stockpile. So if you have an enormous stockpile and you have an enormous dollar problem, which one wins out when you mobilize the stockpile, or does the dollar problem become the greater need? And what we've seen, especially in China, but also elsewhere, is that, central banks, again, they're not good at being substitutes for what a dynamic Eurodollar marketplace provides. So even when they're selling treasuries and mobilizing, the reason I use scare quotes is because they're not necessarily just selling them. They could be using them as collateral in term repo trades. They could be using them as collateral in derivatives trades, currency swaps, all sorts of things off the books, on the books. We don't really know how they're being used because especially the Chinese don't really report to us how they're being used. So what happens is you have this mismatch between a dynamic, a big dollar problem that a dynamic Eurodollar marketplace used to supply to your country, and then when that starts to recede and pull back, you're a central bank operating bureaucratically behind the scenes, clandestinely, whatever. You're not a good enough substitute for that dynamic marketplace. So even though you have a massive pile of treasuries, it's not the same thing as offsetting or being a perfect substitute to the dollars that used to flow into your system.
And that's why in your article, you bring up what the last two heads of the People's Bank of China, the governors there, why they're bringing up the special drawing rights, not as a political intrigue of some sort, but as a plea for help to alleviate this dollar shortage that they're focusing on or that they're experiencing.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing, right? I mean, it's look, if you're actively, purposely de-dollarizing, you've got you've got an alternative currency to fill in the gap as the dollars recede. You're offsetting it with something else to replace it. If you're involuntarily being de-dollared, all you have is currency removed. And therefore, you have all these deflationary consequences to deal with. And what Yang has said, especially going back to 2017, is we need to start thinking about SDRs as that currency to help us fill in this enormous dollar gap that, oh, by the way, in March of 2020 became absolutely enormous. And it's going to cause all sorts of massive problems, especially for emerging market economies who are highly dependent and highly susceptible to these dollar problems. So we have dollars receding, not voluntarily, but because they're being de-dollared, and there's no currency left to fill in the gap. And that's where a deflationary leaky bucket scenario comes from.
Jeff, last question. We're talking about spy thrillers. Have you or do you enjoy reading anything, and by who? Tom Clancy, John le Carre, Ian Fleming?
I spend very little time on fiction and spend most of my time. It's really sad what you said at the beginning. I tend to read mostly research, especially primary source research, which is pretty time intensive. But I think it's especially rewarding because when you look at primary source material, you're looking at it unfiltered. You're actually seeing the data and what was, contemporary sources. What were they saying? What were they thinking? It's not colored by the lens of modern economics. And therefore, you can kind of get to the truth a lot faster. But it's a very labor-intensive process, and it leaves me not much time to do some of these other things, fiction. And I don't even watch movies.
That's why we love you, Jeff. You're doing all that, and then you're sharing it with us, and we're eternally grateful. If anyone wants to read more, you did a follow-up article, and it's called "More to Being De-Dollared," and that will be both in the YouTube description below this video, or if you're listening to a podcast, just check the podcast notes and you'll find the links to all those shows.